my great pleasure to introduce Katie Cunha Lewin. Katie is a London-based author and an academic who specialises in 20th and 21st century literature. She has a PhD in contemporary literature, and her writing has appeared in various places, such as the Times Literary Supplement, I was going to say substance, Times Literary Supplement, the White Review, Irish Times, Los Angeles Review of Books, and she loves exploring issues of writing and the writer in the 21st century. So her little book that we're going to be talking about today, The Hidden Worlds That Shape the Books We Love, it discusses everything from Emily Dickinson's Hidden Writing Pocket, who knew you could write in a pocket, to Lauren Elkin typing on her phone on the bus. You can write anywhere, it seems. And from Maya Angelou's hotel rooms to Ernest Hemingway in Parisian cafés, to the founders of Women of Colour Press around their kitchen tables. So all of these different places we can write, we will be exploring today. So this is going to be the theme of our talk, and at the end, or towards the end of the talk, we're going to have a little bit of conversation to start with, and then there'll be opportunities for you to ask questions. So as you listen to our chat, do think of your own questions that you might like to ask at the end. So I shall take my seat. Right, so Katie, hi. Thank you ever so much for coming today. Perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more about your background, why you decided to write a book about writers, and perhaps if you feel the mood, perhaps read a little bit give us a flavour of the book.
Thank you so much, Annie, and thank you so much to the festival for having me. I'm very happy to be here and to see you all on a Sunday morning. I think that I was always interested in the idea of the writer's room as a pretentious teenager, imagining myself somehow creative by sort of aligning my pens and my pencil on my desk in a certain way. But I think it really sort of started jumping out to me a little bit more when I was doing my PhD. I worked on a writer called Don DeLillo, some of you might have heard of. He wrote White Noise and Underworld, lots of other books as well. He's an American writer. And he really had a preoccupation with the idea of the man alone in a room. So this is an image that is across all of his work in various different ways. And I started noticing this and was really thinking about what he meant by this idea of the man alone in a room. And I think for Don DeLillo, the thing that he was thinking about is himself, in a way, because he was the man alone in a room. He's been writing since the 70s and is still writing now in his 80s. And he was very, that's what he was doing, right? He was alone in his room with his typewriter. He still writes on a typewriter. And this was about the way that he did his work. But it was also for him this idea that the writer works in solitude, works alone, in one space, and that space is from where they report back on the world, as it were. So that little room, the writer's space, is sort of a way out to see the world. And it really interested me that he was so taken with that image. But then at the same time, as I started to think about it a bit more, I realised that actually, in order to be the man alone in a room, there's a lot of assumptions that go behind that. To be alone, to be the man, and to have the room. So all of those assumptions started to kind of jump out at me a little bit more. And I realised that rather than necessarily only celebrating that space, I wanted also to critique that space a little bit and to think about why we're still so enthralled to that image when actually in some ways it's a very exclusive or excluding image. And so I thought I would just read just a couple of paragraphs from the very beginning of the book to sort of give a sense of this space. So this is from the introduction. I can't say how long it's been there, but I have an image in my mind of the place where writers work. I picture the writer, I picture the space, I conjure an atmosphere of quiet calm in which someone can write for many hours undisturbed. This place contains a desk on which lie various tools of writing, and perhaps a large window out of which my writer looks to try to capture the world they depict. There are bookshelves teeming with dog-eared paperbacks, imposing hardbacks, critical anthologies, story collections, art books. My writer is also a reader, and a voracious one at that. They might sit on an old office chair or one made of wood with a rounded back, but it has a squashy pillow nestled into it to keep the writer comfortable, and a blanket thrown over the arm, ready to keep them warm. As well as the copious numbers of books, the writer of my imagination has art on their walls, postcards pinned and askew on a corkboard, prints hung up, and old film posters with a corner that flaps in the breeze. There are other smaller objects too, collected and curated to best inspire. Full of meaning and sentiment, the potency of these objects lies in their creative charge, their inherent inspirational potential just waiting to be drawn out through the process of writing. These objects crowd shelves, hang from the door frames, peek out from behind books, or simply sit next to the writer as companions and friends. Sometimes they can become talismans, items of good luck, or part of the ritual of the day, given a pat or a stroke. The writer's room need not be neat, could in fact be the one space of the house where things are supposed to be messy, to show a mind at work. Proper creativity makes for unkempt spaces. Are there crisp packets or orange peel littering the desk? Discarded tissues, unstable piles of books unread, crumpled papers? No writing room can be pristine, but the detritus must not outweigh the buzzing, trembling atmosphere of solemn, serious work. But what of the person themselves? They are less clear in my mind, a fuzzy outline. What do I know of my imagined writer what I do know, of my imagined writer is that they labour at their work. They are a conduit for that atmosphere they have made, sitting at their desk with a straight back, the pose of the concentrated. They delve into their work, not looking up from the page or the screen for hours at a time. They are a figure of certainty and of authority. The room tells me that they know what they are trying to make. It needs only for them to catch the creative wisp and fix it down in words.
Thank you. So, for the purposes of your book, could you perhaps clarify what you mean by a writer? Are they only writers of creative, like novels and fiction and poetry, or are you including those who are writers of non-fiction? And if both, is there a difference between these writers and perhaps the spaces they would occupy?
Yeah, I think for me what I wanted to do with this book actually was to allow really anyone to have the name of writer. And, you know, so I wasn't distinguishing. I guess I talk a lot in the book about novelists, but also non-fiction writers and poets. But for me, I think something I wanted to do with what I was trying to explore was, I think actually sometimes people can feel a little bit trepidatious about calling themselves a writer, or a little nervous, or sort of add caveats when they say that they're a writer. But for me, if you like writing and are doing that, either in your job or in your spare times, you're a writer. And so you have a writer's space. Wherever you're working is your space. So yeah, I wanted to not really make a kind of hierarchy or a distinction, and actually that if you're doing it, you are a writer.
Yes. So if we write, therefore we am.
Exactly.
Or something.
Yeah, exactly.
So your chapters are divided up by different types of writing rooms. So the first set of writing rooms you look at are the preserved writers' rooms, ones that you might find in a museum or in their preserved home. Some of them seem to have been kind of reconstructed to what the person curating it imagines that the writer's room looked like. But I'm just going to read this bit, because you say that Virginia Woolf, who's one of the writers' rooms you talk about, says that people can be strongly imprinted on their possessions. And so when you visited these spaces, did you feel that sort of the presence of the long-lost writer through these possessions? And did you think we can all be imprinted on our possessions? Can somebody get a sense of us through the things that we treasure?
Yeah, so that quote, Virginia Woolf is talking there about Thomas Carlyle's house, which is in London. It's from an essay that she wrote called Great Men's Houses, and she's being a little bit ironic there. She's saying, you know, authors seem to more strongly imprint themselves on their objects. which is kind of a way she's always writing in that tone of irony. But yes, it's interesting in having visited a few different places and also having looked at a lot of writers' houses and museums put their writers' rooms online during the pandemic, which was super useful for writing this book because it meant I didn't have to travel too far sometimes to see them. And I think really the thing that strikes me is that all of the places in one way or another are trying to give that sense of the writer in that space to greater or lesser success, depending on lots of different things, including how many objects they have of that writer, how long the writer lived there, the material legacy of that writer. So, for example, one book I talk about is the Keats House, which is in Hampstead in London. And the Keats House is quite strange because actually there's not really very many possessions, so it's a little bit sparse and weird. And the writer's room they have, or writer's desk that they have, was a setup that Keats never used, and has objects of Shelley there. So that always kind of struck me as weird. But they do have his death mask there, Keats's death mask, and that's sort of quite strange because then he's sort of present there through that death mask. So that's quite a weird one.
Really imprinted on that one.
Exactly. Yeah. A very particular room is the Freud Museum, which is also in Hampstead in London, and the Freud Museum is quite a specific space because it was taken from Vienna to London, but recreated exactly in the new space. It was the work of a lot of effort by a lot of people to get the possessions of Freud from Vienna to London. And that room is very weird because Freud had these huge collections of antiquities, and he had a really big collection of books. And it's all there in this one space. And you really get a sense in that room of his preoccupations. So his interest in archaeology and that kind of idea of delving. Obviously, he was doing that also with his patients into their unconscious. And so that room is very particular, I think. It also has, of course, the famous sofa on which you were to lie and be, have your discussions with Freud.
Taking back to childhood.
Which is a really interesting object. But I think at the same time, I was going to these spaces with quite a critical eye, and thinking about kind of how these places have been put together and sort of what was and wasn't part of the scenery. One room that I talk about, Virginia Woolf, is really important to this book, obviously, because of her book, A Room of One's Own, from 1929. And her room is quite strange. It's in Sussex, Monk's House in Sussex, in a village called Rodmell. And that desk, her desk, is behind glass, which makes for a really weird visiting experience because it is kind of like a museum piece then. It really makes it feel like a museum object. So not something where a real person lived and worked, but an object of the past, right? Relegated to the past. So that one's a really interesting one. And Jeanette Winterson talked about how this was the most disappointing room in the house when you visit Monk's House. And it's a lovely place to visit because it's got all of the decorations of Vanessa Bell and the kind of particular style of the Bloomsbury group. So it's really gorgeous. But that room is very strange. But I think also knowing about Woolf's biography too, Woolf didn't write at that desk in that way. She sat on a sofa with a board across her lap. And wrote freehand. She did type up the work later, but that wasn't the kind of originary scene. And so also there's something a little bit false about that. And that's something also that I found with a lot of writers' spaces, that actually what they really want to do, because they think that audiences want to see this, or visitors I should say, is have a desk and a chair and a quill or whatever. Really sometimes even if that wasn't how the person worked.
Yes, okay. Which leads me on to I'm going to read a passage from your book, which I was amused because of the So At almost every book event I've been to, someone invariably asks about writing locations, and I found myself slightly despairing at these questions asked with such frequency and with seemingly no forum safe. So, why, if that's what you believe, did you write an entire book dedicating yourself to this rather irksome topic of where writers write?
So I think, yes, so I think what happened was at a certain point I started to realise that at a lot of events that I was attending, this question kept emerging. And so I think it was one that kind of interest that I could see was one of the things that spurred me on to want to write this book, to really think about, okay, well, why is that? What are people asking there? And I think, as I say in the book, one thing I think people are often trying to ask or get at is they're sort of saying, what is it that you're actually doing when you're writing? Because I think it's quite hard for people to envision that actually as work, because, you're sitting there sort of maybe, with your head in your hands or whatever, looking despairingly out the window, and it doesn't really read on your body that you're doing work. But I think that actually, intellectual labour of all different kinds is sometimes kind of disparaged because it doesn't necessarily have the same look as other kinds of work. And so I wanted to really claim this as work. So I kind of was thinking in these audiences, it was kind of audiences being kind of asking, are you really working? Is this what you're doing? And also I think sometimes it was kind of quite strange to me. The example that I give in the book is Hilary Mantel giving the Wreath lecture, and very prestigious things to give the Wreath lectures. And I think, I can't remember which one of the four it was from, but then I think it's Sue Barker then asks, okay, so where do you write? And I thought, oh my goodness, even at the Wreath lecture, you can't escape this question. And so, and maybe, I don't know, maybe someone's going to ask me this as a kind of funny, it has also, people have asked me this too, so it's quite funny. So it's something about, I think, audiences always trying to sort of get back to what writing actually is. And it's because it's a very ephemeral thing, right? It's something that's maybe hard to picture.
It's not usually a spectator sport.
It's not. Yes. But so I understand it, but it also was something that after all, once I started noticing, I couldn't stop.
So in fact, the question kind of inspired the book, even if it was an irksome question.
Exactly.
Yeah. A lot of authors seem to be really influenced by the place that they write. So as a child, I remember going to Hilltop, where Beatrix Potter lived, and you can certainly see objects in her house that appear as illustrations in her lovely books. And so clearly there was an influence there. So do you find that you are influenced in your writing by the place you are while you write? And are some places actually sort of deleterious to the writing? You can't, I don't know, something distracting you or putting you off?
I think the thing with the idea of the writer's space is that for so many different people it looks very different. Mm-hmm. And again, that's sort of something I wanted to explore, that the kind of mythology of the writer's room actually isn't really accompanied by reality, because lots of writers were working in all sorts of circumstances, some that would seem to be, very distracting. I think, I've really like to work in cafés. There's a cafe around the corner of my house, around from the corner of my house, where I have worked a lot and have done a lot of writing. But I also work in the British Library, which is, a very large, I work in one of the reading rooms in the British Library, a very large, very silent room. So I kind of like lots of different kinds of spaces. But one thing I wanted to think about was the fact that, for maybe younger writers, for, the much maligned millennial writer, that actually a notion of, kind of precarity accompanies much of the life of the millennial writer. And so lots of them are working in all sorts of weird spaces. So I think about, there's some young writers who talk about writing in flat shares, where, their housemates are cooking around them while they're sitting at their kitchen table. Or writing in breaks whilst they're working at their waitressing job. And so I wanted to give space to all of those sorts of varieties and say that for lots of people they can make that work. And actually the poet Audre Lorde, who people might know an American 20th century poet, she talks about actually that poetry is a really great form of writing because you can do it anywhere. You can do it it's small, it's compact, you can write it anywhere. And actually I saw a quote the other day from Eileen Miles, another American poet, who said a similar thing, that actually you can look like you're doing one thing, but actually you're really writing a poem at your job, right? And so I think that there's something very nice about that flexibility. And so, yes, I would never say, yes or no to a certain space, because someone will have made it work for themselves.
Yes, for good or ill.
Exactly,
yes.
Exactly.
You talk about the sort of the look of the writer. What does a writer look? I mean, can we look around the audience? Do you think there's some writers? And that some people try and, dress to look like a writer, whatever that might be. So, do you think the job of being a writer somehow changes you from being a regular person? Can we actually ever judge somebody's job by what they look like?
Yeah, so I think about this in a I'm not letting myself off the hook here, right? So I'm also thinking about the ways that I am choosing to present myself in the way, we all do that every day. But it's certainly, I'm making fun of myself too, don't worry. But yes, I could always tell in the British Library, the other English literature PhDs, I really had a good sense of that. And I think a bit about why that might be. And I think for me also part of this is this idea of a sort of, the look of a writer is me trying to get a sense of people trying to make themselves read in some way as creative. And I don't think there's necessarily a problem with that. But I think it's when that sort of starts to become an excluding thing that then that sort of can be a problem, which is why I sort of want to suggest that actually if you do writing, anyone can be a writer. My grandmother, who I talk about a lot in this book and who the book is dedicated to, she's a very voracious reader and a very keen writer. And she hasn't got glasses on like this, So she's not thinking about self-presentation when she's writing her family chronicles. But yeah, I think something I wanted to think about was the way that maybe alongside the kind of perfect writer's room, that also went along with the sort of certain kind of writer's style or writer's objects that you were supposed to have in some way. And so I think for me, it's about exploring ideas of exclusion or inclusion, but also authenticity as well, about, what is kind of, is there an authentic way of presenting in that? And I would suggest no. But it's really interesting to think about, there's lots of interesting scholarship about this, about the way that kind of writers present themselves. Some interesting stuff about Jonathan Franzen I include in this book, where, he sort of presented himself as a defender of the literary, and was very upset when his book was included in Oprah's book club, because it meant that he wasn't serious, right? Because that was for an audience of mostly women. And there's a scholar who wrote about the fact that actually, in kind of response to that, he would present himself in sort of suit jackets, right? Like the kind of serious worker writer. And I thought that was so silly, that, somehow you needed to present yourself as a defender of the literary. So I'm sort of being a little bit, playful here. And absolutely thinking it's kind of a way of reflecting on some of those ideas that are kind of crucial to the book.
Yeah, some people writing books that are good for you rather than necessarily enjoyable to read by the sound of it. You talk quite a bit about some writers being quite reclusive and perhaps wishing to remain out of the public eye, and perhaps that's why they're cloistering themselves away to do their writing. But I mean, these days of social media and all the rest of it, and also publishers trying to push their authors out there and kind of sometimes outing them for trying to write under a pseudonym, because there are quite a few. I mean, historically, women would often write under men's names, like think about the Bronte sisters. I mean, was it Bell, the surname that they adopted, and the different male names, and then also more recently, quite a few female authors, for their writing for a sort of young teenage audience, so as not to put off the boys, would write with their initials. So you can think of J.K. Rowling and M.G. Harrison and things. So they're women. They're not denying their first names, but not actually putting them out there particularly. So do you think that it's right for publishers to try and push their authors into the public eye? And I mean, thinking back to J.K. Rowling, when she adopted the name Robert Galbraith to write a different style of novel, she wanted to be known for her book rather than her name. And then within no time at all, somebody doubted it, that was who it was. And so she kind of lost that experiment, which was to see if she could become successful again. So what do you think about this sort of outing their authors, or should we allow to just be a non who seems to have been the most prolific author of all time?
Yeah, I think that question of anonymity is a really interesting one, and should just say I'm not here under duress. I'm here from my publisher. I'm here of my own accord. I think that there's a sort of tension always between your object of as a creative work, and then also the kind of marketization of publishing and the fact that it's a really, really big business now. And I don't know if people sort of follow, or if you're interested in publishing, there's been lots and lots of discussion about the fact that in America now we have this situation in which basically there are 5 publishers that own most of the imprints that you would read. So even if you think that there's a book that is from an independent publisher or a smaller publisher, actually oftentimes if you go up, it's owned by a big publisher. And so the conglomeration factor is a really weird thing because it's just about the business of writing. And so along with the business comes with the pressure to sell more and more. And so I think that there is certainly a sort of push for writers to make themselves available in lots of different ways. And some writers are more comfortable with that than others. And so I think recently, if people saw the story about the writer Helen DeWitt, the American writer, who refused the Wyndham Campbell Prize, $175,000, because she didn't want to participate in the promotional activities that went along with that. And of course, a lot of people were really upset with her for doing that, because it's a lot of money and it's a very prestigious prize. But for Helen DeWitt, what she said was that actually she's dealing with the effects of long COVID, and it's just not manageable for her to do the promotional activities that she would have been asked to do. And so actually, a lot of times with this kind of visibility or the pressure to be visible, there goes a lot of, again, assumptions about what that means. So that that you're able-bodied, that you're not unwell, that you can find someone to care for your children. All of that kind of goes along with it. So I think it's a really tough thing, because also as a writer you want to talk to people, you want to have interesting discussions. I really love talking about my book and about this topic with people, but then at the same time there's also this idea of when it feels a kind of pressure to be made available. And I think also with social media, writers sometimes can be more and more available online. And so I talk a bit about writers who've done this. Joyce Carol Oates, maybe people know the American writer, had for a while a really great Twitter account where she would just post loads of her thoughts. And, she became very well known, sort of in a way, not for her books, but, for being great on Twitter. And so, that's a kind of weird moment that we find ourselves in. And I don't know, I think for writers it's very hard to sort of push back or understand what they can and can't say no to. But this is where kind of writers' organisations are really useful, and organisations like the Writers' Union, the Society of Authors, are sort of helpful with kind of giving you a place where you can go and to sort of understand what your rights are. But it's a really tricky issue, I think, and it's the kind of the moment where writers kind of turn into celebrities. I think that's a kind of a tricky space, and what that means for the kind of what we want them to do. We sort of want them to produce more and more for us in some way. And so I don't have a solution to this, but I think it's an interesting problem.
But you think that the people should be allowed to keep a private space if they...
Totally. Yeah. So Sally Rooney, for example, is a really interesting writer because she, is, very outspoken about things she cares about Gaza, about supporting BDS. But, she has a really interesting thing. Well, I noticed this, I talk about this in the book, that she is never pictured in front of a desk, actually. We don't never go to see Sally Rooney in her house. And I really feel like her doing that, not showing herself in that space, is about her sort of staking a claim for her private life, I think. And so, yes, I think totally. And of course, Elena Ferrante as well, another famous example, who said she doesn't want her interviews to do the work for her. Her work is her work, and she wants that to kind of stand on its own.
Yes, that's good. You rather charmingly talk about collecting souvenirs from the various places that you visit, you know, postcard from here, or, you know, your fridge magnet, or whatever it might be. And so you're collecting all this sort of memorabilia together. Did any of you go to Dallas Campbell's talk last weekend, where he said he'd scraped the contents of his desk off, didn't he, and brought it along for us all to see. So he had all these wonderful objects, and some, you know, were quite rare copies of magazines and things like that, and a little bit of moon regolith, even if it was synthesised. All sorts of exciting things. So he was clearly inspired by all these objects that he had on his desk, which he brought for us to look at, to write this wonderful book, which, if you've seen the copy, it's like a big sort of scrapbook of all these exciting space-related things. So in a similar way to Dallas being inspired by all these spacey objects, are you inspired by the things that you collect, whether from other authors or from wherever you go on holiday or whatever? And perhaps will these, you know, when we preserve your writing space for people in the future to come visit, which objects would you like to be there that say, this is Katie's space and this is what inspired her?
Well, I don't have anything as exciting as bits of moon, I have to say.
Yet.
Yeah, I think that I sort of had this desire to collect nothing interesting, really, a little fridge magnet here or there. And I write in the book that I really would have liked at Virginia Woolf's house for there to have been more things for me to have bought, but they were far too tasteful for that. I was really, in my mind, I really wanted a tea towel. That was in my mind. I was like, a Virginia Woolf tea towel. I think that would be good. But I didn't have that. I think I just got bits and bobs here and there, but my space now is very informal in that I had a room of my own for a little while, and then my son, an interloper, arrived, and I no longer have that space, and so I don't have a particularly aesthetic desk at all. A few kind of objects that I have which are important. I have a picture that my friend did, a version of a Matisse picture, which is of a woman reading at a desk. And she did this as I was finishing my master's. And I had a sort of reputation at that point for the kitchen table of my house share to be sort of piled with books. So that's a nice kind of personal thing that I have. And I guess a thing really I would need to have is cat hair, because my cat, she sits on my lap, and when I was finishing my PhD, she sat with me the whole time with her paws on the desk, and just sat on my lap whilst I was kind of typing over her. She's quite fat, so I was typing over her. So it would need a little bit of cat hair.
Yes, quite right.
So not glamorous.
And does your cat, like mine, does type as well? She
doesn't type, but she rubs her face on the laptop and then makes it hard for me to keep concentrating on it and shifts it about.
Yes.
So some evidence of Bartleby would be good.
Yeah, my Merlin is really an appalling speller, I can tell you. Appalling. Perhaps going from cats writing to again we touched, and I think there's been various bits in the festival this year about AI and how it's doing creative writing, whatever that could mean. Do you ever come a time when we can't tell the difference between creative writing written by a real person and an AI bot?
I think it's a really strange topic. It's one that I sort of tried to think about in subsequent work at the moment, in a project that I'm trying to develop. And I think it's a really strange problem, because I think in a way something that's quite interesting about writers or writing is that there have been ways, or writers have always been thinking about the way that technology impacts on writing. But it's kind of been a thing that people have worried about for a long time. So even in Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, there's one section in which there's a kind of machine that can program stories. And that would, and not just stories, program all sorts of different kinds of writing. And so this machine is, doing the thinking for you. And, Jonathan Swift was thinking about that then. And then, Roald Dahl has the story, The Great Grammaticizer, in which it's a machine that can just produce stories over and over again, and it becomes a sort of, all writers start to adopt, the work of the machine as their own, and the writer in that story is kind of setting themselves apart by stopping themselves doing that. And so I think writers have always been worrying about this, and this has been a kind of perpetual problem, which is the idea of creative work as a thing in and of itself that is untouched by something else. And Ben Lerner recently has a brilliant story, The Hoffman Wobble, in which at the end he gets an AI to write the ending of his story for him, and it's really terrible. It's a really bad ending, but it's a story about Wikipedia, but it's also about the transformations of technology. And so I think that there's a way that people can do really interesting things with AI and with technology, but I am, of course, very nervous when people allow it to do their creative work for them or their thinking for them. And I know that, there's constant shifts and changes, and that, when I was teaching my undergraduate students in 2023, the difference between the AI work that was present then when I came, I had a year off on my maternity leave and then came back, and the difference between 2023 and 2024 in the work that they were showing me was so scary, because it was so much better in a short space of time. And so I think that's something that is sort of, this idea of detection is a really weird problem, because it makes us all sort of suspicious of language, right? That we're being all sort of asked to be these checkers between if something is and isn't AI. But my suggestion in this book is that I think that there'll be a sort of push, actually, in a way, for writers to become more visible as a result of AI, which is for them to show exactly that they have they have been the ones to do this work. And the Society of Authors already has a stamp that you can add to your book which says human authored. So, this is something that people are already thinking about, which is how you can make that kind of...
But you can't have an AI-generated stamp that says human author, but it isn't.
I don't know. But so I think that there'll be, maybe in some ways, writers will feel the need to make themselves more visible, to say, I did do this work, and sort of a little bit more justification. So I think it, in a way, maybe will make them be more emphasis on the idea of the writer's room in some way.
But it's a bit like the idea of defending your thesis. I mean, the whole point of the defence of the thesis is to prove that it's your work and that you kind of wrote it and you know what it's about. So perhaps this sort of thing, we're just checking that you've read it yourself. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, in a minute, I hope you've all been thinking of questions. I'm going to ask you to come up with your own questions, but I have a final question for you. Slight curveball, right? So you have the power to put up a blue plaque somewhere, okay? And you can commemorate any writer you like, living or dead, but usually they go for dead people, don't they, for blue plaques, but I'll stretch it slightly. So for whom would you commemorate in this, and where would you put your plaque?
Yeah, so I have one answer, which is the sort of, working along those terms, but I am quite critical, actually, of blue plaques in some ways, in the kind of preservation.
Yours, then, shall I?
But the one that I've always thought should be there is that the American writer James Baldwin, who I talk about quite a lot at the end of this book, he lived for a few months in a flat in Tedworth Square in London, and I always thought that there should be a plaque there, because Mark Twain, the American writer, I'm sure everyone knows Mark Twain, he has a blue plaque there already, and I always thought, why does James Baldwin not have one when Mark Twain has one in that same square? So that felt quite an obvious kind of disparity to me that should be rectified, because they lived there for similar amounts of time as well. But more generally, I think I would like a plaque for people who don't have writers' rooms or haven't had spaces. So I would like a kind of something that commemorates everyone who's written their novels on their commute, or whilst they're
The
bus station, yeah, or while they're pushing a buggy, leaving a voice note, which is what I was doing. And so I think I would like something for that, for all the people who haven't had their own spaces that they've owned.
Yes. So on that note, and I suppose, well, let's see what the questions come up with. So, thank you very much so far. Have we got any questions from you lovely audience? I'm going to stand up because I can't see to the back. Yes, right at the back. Have we got a microphone? We have. I'll wait for the microphone, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was very interesting.
Thank
You mentioned the Brontes briefly. Have you ever visited the Parsonage Museum, which is marketed as a museum? But of course you can go in and... Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't want to hold it too close. It's marketed as a museum, but of course you can go in and see the table where the three sisters wrote. And there are lots of objects. When I went, I was very aware that the house had been a home, a working space. So although it's presented as a museum, there are lots of little artefacts. I just wondered if you'd ever been and what you thought about it.
Well, actually, to my shame, I haven't been to that space just
Yet.
Yes,
Yet.
but no, but it was certainly one that I was thinking about, and yes, and I have a sketch made by one of the Brontes for chapter 3, as Annie is perfectly demonstrating. It starts at chapter 3 because I thought it was so lovely that the three sisters, Anne Branwell too, sat at that table all together, and I thought that was a really lovely version of a kind of shared collaborative space, which is something that I really wanted to focus on in this book, and a space of not being, in solitude, right? That they were working together and collaborating. And I think it's a really interesting point that you bring up, because there is that sort of tension in some of these places between the fact that it was a house, as you said, a domestic space, but then also one where this work was happening, and to think about the relationship between those spaces is interesting, particularly in the fact that the sisters were also maintaining the house. We're doing lots of chores, we're keeping the house, and I think there's something really important, I think, for women writers who are working in their houses to claim that space not just as a domestic one, but also as a space of work too. And I think there's always, for lots of women writers, there will always be that tension there. And lots of writers talk about the fact, I talk about some women writers in this book who said that they had to leave their house because otherwise they would have done chores instead. And this was something that I have to do too. Like, I definitely have to leave my house because otherwise I will just start hoovering. And there is a sort of always a tension there. It's an important idea, I think, between the house as a space of maintenance and of one particular kind of care work, domestic work, but then also totally as its opposition to of one of really proper intellectual labour. Yeah, so thank you.
Have you got any questions? Yes. You just wait for the microphone, please. Thank you.
I was just interested in what you were saying about people viewing writer spaces almost as a way of questioning whether writing is work as such. I think I would come, as a non-writer, come from it from the other side of almost, it's where the magic happens, and if you, particularly fiction writing, to try and understand how people can from nothing generate these wonderful works. But it was interesting that you viewed it the other way.
Yeah. No, I think you're totally right. It has that sort of dual possibility, doesn't it? Because I think also it is quite amazing that writers are able to do the work that they do, totally. So I think it's about sort of, for me, I think the kind of thing I was trying to pull out with this book was when that sort of magic or mythology then became a sort of uniformity, that you have to have this kind of magical space in order to be able to produce works that are worthwhile, because, the kind of legacy of the writer's room is very bound up in, the kind of masculine space of the Victorian studies, kind of, I think a little bit about that, the kind of legacy of the Victorian study, the room where, you know, your family wouldn't go, and you know, you were allowed to be alone with no interruption. And so I think you're totally right, but I think it's also, for me, about when that space starts to become something more, or start to signify more. And, you know, hence my irritation with people asking these questions at events, because it was making me think, well, actually, what happens if the writer said, I wrote this in a very ugly way, you know, that they didn't say that they had a nice table. I always wondered, oh, would the audience be really disappointed if the person said, oh, yeah, I just wrote this, you know, like I wrote it really quickly in between making dinner, you know. So I always wondered about what would happen if people weren't allowed to have that space. What would audiences think? But, you know, you're totally right. I took a really bad picture of Virginia Woolf's desk and then did keep looking at it. And, you know, I was like, what am I looking at here? What am I looking for? But I was trying to think about, could I see something there? Or, like, was there something particular? But I think it's something that we're always going to be fascinated by in some way.
I think there's even more kind of impressive, more impressive when people do write in lots of different places. I think that is it's amazing if people can do that on the bus or.
But there's no preserved spaces of that, right? No. There's no seat on a bus, which I would love that. Yeah. I would love that.
So maybe at the front. Thanks.
Thank you. I was quite interested in the marketing opportunities that why people find it so powerful. For example, you go to Porto, and you go to Edinburgh, and it's all J.K. Rowling worked in all these cafés, and it's the same with Jamaica Inn, and they've got like the museum in the pub, and it's allegedly her desk from Menabili or something, but it's sort of. Well, I wonder why it's so enduring that people are so fascinated by it, and it's so powerful in a commercial way.
Yeah, I love examples of that. I think of in Lisbon.
Was it Lisbon or was it Porto? Oh, it was Lisbon. I've been to it. Yeah, Lisbon. I've been to Lisbon. Yeah. It's
the Lisbon one. I always get confused.
Yeah, I went to the pub.
Yeah, don't worry. Fernando Pessoa, you're thinking of the writer, the modernist writer, who in his life was, you know, not this celebrated. I find that one so strange because he writes these really weird books. The Book of Disquiet, if anyone's ever read that book, it's a very strange kind of modernist work where he writes with lots of these weird, he calls them his heteronyms from these different perspectives. And now, he's sort of everywhere in Lisbon. And I just think that is so, like, that would have been anathema to Pessoa, you know. And that one strikes me in a really interesting way.
You go to the room when you order him a coffee in case he comes in.
Right, okay. Well, so there's a lot of, so this idea of literary tourism is a very big thing that, you know, and I talk about a few scholars. I actually had loads more stuff in here about literary tourism, but my editor was like, you're getting too into the weeds here. Well, there's lots of scholarship, actually. Lots of scholars have written about this because people have done kind of the literary tourist thing for so long. Petrarch in the 14th century, people were going and trying to find Petrarch. And so, you know, there's kind of a long history of this, of kind of associating writers with particular places as if they have sort of put their indelible mark on that place. But I always wonder about what the writer themselves would think, because, you know, not all places are happy places for those writers. So I wonder about that. But it becomes a kind of part of your sort of tick list, right, that you can do in a certain city. You go to see a museum, you go to see some ruins, and you go to see the writer's house. Again, I'm not taking myself out of this. I'm going to Rye in a few weeks, and I'm going to go and look at Henry James's house. I am going to do that. So, you know, it's just sort of becomes part of this kind of itinerary of a certain place. But it's very much to do with, you know, the idea of putting yourselves in kind of parallel or in the shoes of important people, right? And somehow trying to get a sense of what makes them kind of creative. I think a bit about that when I'm imagining people going into certain rooms in certain houses and sort of, I guess if people are sort of wondering, well, if I look out of this window, the window that X, Y, or Z person would have looked at, will I also feel the same kinds of inspiration? And I think it's a fair question, right? How do we make our lives creative? How do we feel inspiration? How do we find a spark? But at the same time, I find it very funny sometimes when cities make themselves very associated with writers. Yeah, thank you.
Yes. I'm sure it's not just writers that people go on pilgrimages to. I'll better take some from this side. So we'll go here, and then we'll come to you, and I think that'll be the end. So there's a gentleman at the front. Thank you. And then there was another question behind. It was you. Yes, thanks.
You talked about yourself needing to get out of the house and write in cafés. Do you think there's enough places for people to write? Do you ever crave for sort of more places where you can go and just be quiet and sort of write outside of libraries and kind of cafés? And have you seen any other countries that sort of are doing that maybe more than we are?
A different type of space, are you thinking about?
Yeah.
I think that's such a good question and a really important one, because there is certainly a dearth of spaces, free spaces also I'm particularly thinking of, because even with a cafe, you do keep having to buy coffees, right, or lunch, and that's not accessible for everyone. So yes, certainly it's on my mind. In Newcastle, they were working on having a development of a building, Bolbeck Hall, which they were going to turn into a writer's centre, and they had all sorts of, it sounded so dreamy. It was like there would be events, and the Northumbria University were going to do kind of part of their teaching there, and I was actually looking into it recently to see where it was in the development, and it had fallen through, this plan. And I was devastated because it was exactly the space that I envisioned, which was that it would have a cafe, it would have a bookshop, but it would also have lots of desks for people just to go and write. And I think at this moment when we see libraries shutting down or libraries kind of reformulating themselves so they're not really necessarily quiet spaces anymore, but sort of more community hubs, I think it's so important for there to be a kind of push for spaces for people to work. The thing that I would love is abandoned buildings. I talk about this in the book. Abandoned buildings done up super cheaply, with Wi-Fi and like a sink or whatever and a toilet, and then people could just go there for cheap, for peppercorn rent, and just go and work there. And I think we really need spaces like that, because even the British Library is a space I talk about in the book. It has its own kind of exclusive feeling. Some people say they don't like going there, the rigmarole, the lockers, all of that. And so I think spaces that feel open and accessible for people to go, I would love those. So if people know of other places doing this sort of thing, I would really like to know, because I think, it would be important to kind of publicise that. Thank you for the question.
Yes. Was it?
Thank you so much for the lovely talk. When you were talking about how everyone is essentially a writer. And with things like Book Talk becoming a thing, Wattpad becoming a huge thing. I grew up with Wattpad myself. So I was wondering, is there a place where you draw the line with them being like, okay, you're not a writer essentially because of the themes that you are talking about is particularly dark or in some cases unlawful. People like, say, authors like Colleen Hoover, who have portrayed themes in the book that are non-consensual, consensual, things like that they have also been okay with real life. Do you then go back and say, like, okay, maybe don't publish a book respectfully? So what do you think about things like that?
I don't know. I don't know about that case that you're mentioning about what she wrote about. I guess I would say that I wouldn't really want to kind of police something like that, maybe. And it wouldn't really be for me to say anyway. But I think that the kind of places you're talking about, Wattpad and various other kind of platforms online that allow people to write in different ways are really interesting, and they're really allowing people to work in different ways. So in some ways, a kind of a lot more of an old-fashioned way, kind of on places where they're sort of serializing works in response to, audience participation and audience notes. So I think it's really interesting. It's an interesting moment for people to kind of move away from the old model of you get an agent, then you get a book deal, and then you kind of work in that way. And so, no, I guess I wouldn't. I guess, as I said, I don't know what you're describing. But I would say that, I would allow people that opportunity to do creative work in however it manifests for them.
Okay, I think we'll have the final question over by the window, please. Thank you.
When you were doing your research, did you start with authors that you already knew had a space that you could write about, or did you pick on random authors and then go and find out, and some you were disappointed and some you were happy with? How did you start, and how did you decide which to include and which to leave out?
Oh man, you should see my notes. I have so many notes, and the book could have been much longer and have a totally different cast of characters, and that's something actually I want to kind of think about, or when I'm talking about the book, I really want to say is that this is by no means an exhaustive list, right, of people, and that actually a different person will have put together a different book of other writers, and so I started off with I sort of had been collecting a few people as I had gone. And, starting, as I said, with Don DeLillo. But then with Virginia Woolf, I think what was so useful about her is that she not only has Monk's House, as I discussed, but she has that really brilliant essay, Great Men's Houses, which was she published in a magazine in the beginning of the 1930s. And so from her, I went outwards. So she was writing about the Thomas Carlyle house in that essay. So then I went to the Thomas Carlyle house. And then from the Thomas Carlyle house, I was going to include the Samuel Johnson house, but I didn't have room. And so, I think one thing that I wanted was for the book really to be led by my interests, was to be led by who I was interested in. But then after a while, it became, I wanted to find a writer who wrote at a kitchen table. And so, I wanted to kind of have those, but there's also, I think, if you read articles periodically, there's articles on writers' rooms in The Guardian or whatever, and they always have the same kinds of people. They have Dylan Thomas, they have Roald Dahl, they have, who else? They have some other people. And I didn't necessarily want to write about the most overtly famous spaces, but the Freud Museum, for example, I think is a really interesting one because the story of his space is also about escaping from Vienna and about the Second World War and, the danger that he was in, that his life was in. And so, some of those, they have really good stories behind them. But then some of them also, it became sort of, from my own kind of passion. But as I said, my notes are I have documents of pages and pages and pages of notes of other people I could have included. And I wanted to I started a Substack to have a couple of other writers on there. I talk about a few writers I haven't had space to put in the book. So I probably will keep doing that as I go, just other writers that I thought would be interesting to discuss. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you all for attending today. We've not reached the end of the festival yet. It keeps going till the 12th of June, so do make sure you've got your little booklet and attend some of our other lovely events. Katie's kindly agreed to sign copies of her book if you would like to find out more about some of these wonderful writers and their spaces. So she'll be at the Fox Lane books signing place downstairs if you would like to buy a book or just to have a chat and tell how wonderful she is. But before all of that, can we thank Katie very, very much for an fascinating talk.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.